Shabbat Shalom. Just get organized up here. Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. So I'd like us to begin this week in maybe a slightly counterintuitive place, which is to think about the standard notice of condolence that goes out from Adat Ariel, or indeed from many other congregations. Yes, if you can picture that in your mind. The condolence email. Ours has a white rose on it. And in ours, the heading reads, condolence for, and then the person's name. And then it states their relationship to our member, if the person wasn't a member. So condolence for name, mother of, member name. And then it continues, it is with regret, it says, that I inform you of the passing of, and then the person's name on date. And then we put in various other particulars that the community needs to know, like where the funeral is going to be, where the shiva is going to be held, and so on, and then the notice is signed. And I would venture to suggest that that is a pretty standard format for a notice of condolence that goes out not just from any synagogue, but I would suggest from other places of worship to their members as well. And I begin there because I was astonished. Every so often I will read a Torah portion and I will realize that something has been directly under my nose for years that I've been alive, and I never actually noticed it before, and this was one of those, which is that when the Torah is talking about the end of somebody's life, it uses a completely different format. Right from the outset of the Torah, there are genealogies all the way through Genesis, 10 generations at the end of the book of Genesis itself, another 10 generations at the end of the book of Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Yes, all the way through. And from the outset, if you look at the way that those characters leaving the world is described, the emphasis is entirely elsewhere. So here, for an example, is the description of Adam, the very first human being. Here's what it says about him. It says, quote, when Adam had lived 130 years, he begot a son in his likeness and after his image, and he named him Seth. After the birth of Seth, Adam lived 800 years and begot sons and daughters. All the days that Adam lived came to 930 years, and he died. And the genealogies of Seth and his succeeding generations are expressed in a similar way. And we get the same poetic formula to describe those generations of Noah all the way down to Abraham. Now, what do we notice about this formulation when we compare it to the standard notice of condolence? We notice, of course, that the references to life far outweigh the references to death, not only in their frequency, but also in their priority. We are told that the person lived, we're told that they lived, we're told that they lived, and only then, almost as an afterthought, are we told that they died. Death comes at the end of the sentence in the Torah, not at the beginning. And that, I suggest, pushes us towards thinking that what is important is not that the person died, because, after all, we know that human beings have built-in obsolescence in that way, and it's unavoidable. Not that the person died, which is to be expected, but rather how that person lived. And the same is true of the opening of today's Torah portion that I guided you to when we were setting up for the Torah reading. This is what it says, and I quote, Jacob lived 17 years in the land of Egypt, so that the days of Jacob's life came to 157 years. And it's only after this announcement of the days of his life has been made that the Torah then permits itself to go on to the deathbed scene, the blessings that he gives to his grandchildren, and his eventual departure from the world. So it would seem that when the Torah announces the passing of one of our ancestors from the world, the emphasis is not on the fact that they died, but rather on the fact that they lived. And quite often, that is a fact that is repeated. So I'd like us to take that whole thought and I'd like to put it over there for a moment, because I want to bring in another thought, and I hope that I'm going to be able to combine them. You'll tell me if I manage to do that or not. So here is the second thought that I'd like us to work with this morning. It's one that I encountered a little while ago, and I have been keeping in the back of my mind, hoping that one day we would hit a sermon that I could incorporate it in. That's today. Many of you, I hope, will know the work of the poet Mary Oliver. Just show me if you do. I'm seeing some nodding. Yes, good. Okay. If you don't, homework. Okay? You really need to know this woman's poetry. It's beautiful. I am not going to get distracted in talking about Mary Oliver the poet right now. I'm just going to tell you that your life will be vastly improved if you know her writing. And this is a line from one of her longer poems. It's got a long title as well. The title is, "Have you ever tried to enter the long black branches?" Have you ever tried to enter the long black branches? She writes extensively about the human relationship with nature, and this is one of those poems. And the thrust of this poem is that she's writing about the way that we hold ourselves back from experiencing the fullness of life, that there's something within us that is stopping us fully and openly stepping into the richness that is our lives and what our lives have to offer us. And she urges us within the poem to find our way back to that richness. I'm going to quote her now. She writes, "Well, there is time left. Fields everywhere invite you into them, and who will care? Who will chide you if you wander away from wherever you are to look for your soul? Quickly then, get up, put on your coat, leave your desk," she urges. And later in the poem, and this is the line I want us to hold on to, she asks, quote, "Listen, are you breathing just a little and calling it a life?" I'll say it again because it's just so good. Listen, are you breathing just a little and calling it a life? And I want to suggest that the lesson that Mary Oliver is trying to teach us, and the lesson that is implicit in the way that the Torah describes the death of our earliest ancestors, is the same lesson. How do we engage with the ultimate challenge of truly living our life? So that we're not just breathing, a little. Now, we will have noticed the rather lovely coincidence this year of this particular Sidra with the start of the secular year. Hands up if you have encountered in your Facebook feed or whatever else you read an article or a posting or a tweet or a whatnot about promises that we make to ourselves for the new secular year. Hands up. Okay, there must be hundreds of these things. I went for an explore on the internet yesterday. So, for example, you get the publicized concept of the bucket list, which apparently is originally a term that comes from computing. I did not know that. But the bucket list, the checklist of things that I must do before I die. There are articles with ironic headings, like the one I found that said, "This year I will be slightly less useless." Okay? There are time-specific articles. How to live a more meaningful life in 7 days. And the possibly over-optimistic 101 ways to live a more meaningful life. And any of us, if we wish, can get on the internet after Shabbat and find many such similar shopping lists to guide or provoke us towards that question. The question is an important question. We shouldn't be scornful about it. How do we live a fuller life? And perhaps for us Jews who've got one foot in a completely different calendar altogether, we're about 3 months out now from the promises that we made to ourselves in our own season of renewal and repentance. And maybe it's a good time right now to go back and check what we were saying to ourselves then and see if we're still coming up with the goods. But, pardon me, but while those pieces are useful, I do believe that they have their uses. I don't want to disparage them just because I'm trying to be funny about them. I'm not sure that they actually provide a real solution to the challenge that the Torah and Mary Oliver respectively are throwing down to us. Because I'm not sure that a list, however comprehensive the list, I'm not sure that a list of items helps us really to live rather than just breathe. I think there has to be something a little bit different. And it was with that mindset that I went to our tradition with the question, does our tradition do this? Does our tradition anywhere provide us with a list of how to live a better and more fulfilled life? And actually it does. You find it in the Talmud. You find it on page 31a of the Talmud. It was taught by the 4th century teacher by the name of Rava. It's a list, but it's a different kind of list. It takes the form not of statements or demands. Get out into nature more. Think more about what you want. It doesn't do that. It asks us questions. Yes, it's a list. But it's a list that is comprised of questions that are going to be asked us when we get to the threshold of heaven. Did you conduct your business affairs faithfully? Did you establish time for the study of Torah? Were you involved in raising children? Did you yearn for redemption? Did you engage in the search for wisdom? And did you understand one thing from another? And that, I think, is an inspiring formulation to follow. If we don't statement about our lives, but if instead we open ourselves up to the idea that there are questions that we should be asking ourselves, then I think we get a much greater range of possible responses and a much greater range of ways to live our lives, because we're Jews and we know that any question has got at least 2 answers. And probably more than that. So, I want us to do a very brief exercise. This would be an interesting one to do in workshop, but then I would keep you here until 1 o'clock, and then you wouldn't like me anymore. So that's assuming that you like me anyway. So we're not going to do that, but I'm going to take us on a whistle-stop tour through the places in the Torah where our ancestors' lives are described as they are leaving the world. Just like I described Adam's life at the beginning and Jacob's life at the beginning of this Sidra. And I'm going to set ourselves the task of, if we look at that description, what is the question that we can generate from that description that will help us to live rather than just breathing. Ready? Okay, so here we go. We've looked at Adam. It's told in 2 parts, if you remember. There's the years that he lived before producing an heir, and there's the years that he lived afterwards. And I think this gives us 2 questions to ask ourselves. The first is something like, what gives my life meaning for me alone? Just me. And the second one is, what legacy am I leaving for the world? What gives my life meaning for myself? And what legacy am I leaving the world? Adam. Noah. The Torah tells us Noah lived after the flood 350 years, and all the days of Noah came to 950 years. And then he died. And from that, perhaps, we can formulate a question of how we live through and after huge formative events in our lives. Possibly here we're looking at a question that goes something like, how do I live through the significant events of my life, and how do they change me? And we place that question with the questions that we raised from Adam. And I'll be putting them together again as another list at the end. The next ancestor we encounter in the order of the Torah is Sarah. Commentators have spoken about the way that Sarah's life is expressed. It says, the life of Sarah came to 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. And there's a very famous Rashi, that famous medieval commentator, there's a very famous Rashi on this one that says, why does the Torah tell it that way? Why does it itemize out 100 years, 20 years, and 7 years? Well, says Rashi, it's to teach us that when she was 100, she was like a 20-year-old in terms of her righteousness. And when she was 20, she was a 7-year-old in terms of her beauty. So perhaps Sarah's question would be, how do I retain my youth as time goes by question? A question something like, how do I approach my life with an open mind and a sense of wonder? From Sarah we go to Abraham, and Abraham is described this way. These are the days of the life of Abraham, which he lived 175 years. And we can extrapolate another question from the fact that this mentions days. We can ask ourselves, how do I value my days, not just my years? How do I look back at the end of a day and say, today I really lived? Next is Isaac. The days of Isaac were 100 years and 80 years, and, I'm cheating a bit, in the next verse, it says that Isaac was buried at a ripe old age, sakein usavea. So perhaps his question could be, how do I create years which are rich and fulfilling? And that sits very nicely with the Abraham question. Listen to them together. How do I value my days, not just my years? How do I create years which are rich and fulfilling? And finally, we come to Jacob. Jacob lived 17 years in the land of Egypt, so that the days of Jacob's life came to 157 years. And it gives us our final question for this list. How do I live meaningfully with my surroundings, even if they change? Or, if we telescope it, how do I live meaningfully with change? Jacob never intended, after all, to end up in the land of Egypt. So let me recap. We just did an enormous amount of Torah study in a very short period of time. Well done. So we notice that unlike a standard condolence notice, the Torah emphasizes life over death, not just once, but over and over again in a way that makes us realize that it can't be a coincidence. Then we take up Mary Oliver's challenge. Are we breathing just a little and calling it a life? How do we live deeper? How do we live richer? We rejected the idea of there being a master to-do list of statements to address this, and instead we bound ourselves, as Jews throughout the millennia have done, to the idea of asking questions. So once again, to conclude, here is the list of questions that we generated. And I would like us to see whether if we hold those questions, if we try, as Rilke so famously said, the poet Rilke, to live the questions, because only through living the questions do we get to the answers, maybe at the end of our own lives, people will say, Vayechi, or Vatchi, he or she lived. Here are the questions again. What gives my life meaning for myself alone? What legacy am I leaving the world? How do I live through the significant events of my life, and how do they change me? How do I live after those events are over? How do I approach my life with an open mind and a sense of wonder? How do I value my days, not just my years? How do I create years which are rich and fulfilling? How do I live meaningfully with change? Perhaps if we hold those questions, we will get to Vayechi. Shabbat Shalom.